Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from my backyard in beautiful Los Angeles, California. How is everybody doing today? I hope you're well. I hope you're happy. I hope you're healthy. I hope you're having some fun. In preparing for these critter chats, I tried to take a good look at what I've talked about recently and look for any animals that I might be missing that would be very different than what I have been talking about. And I realized that there's a whole section of animals that I haven't talked about very much. I've touched on them a little bit. So I'm going to try to incorporate them a little bit more. And that brings us to the subject of today's critter chat, the sea stars. Now, sea stars have often been called starfish. I called them starfish for many, many years in my life. But they're not technically fish, so they're not starfish. Scientists and conservationists especially prefer the term sea stars because fish, they have fins and they have gills and they have a skeleton that includes a backbone. And sea stars, they don't have any of those things, so they're not a fish. So today I will use the term sea star. I'm not going to beat you up. I'm not going to threaten you if you call them starfish. At the aquarium, we do prefer sea stars, but we do welcome people who call them starfish as well. Both terms are used quite often. Sea star is kind of the more scientifically accurate name. Starfish is the name that many of us grew up using and many people continue to use to this day. So if they're not fish, what are they? Well, for starters, when we're looking at an animal and we're trying to classify it and figure out where it fits in the big animal kingdom, the very first question we ask is, does it have a backbone? Because that's the first big division. Vertebrates, animals that have a backbone or a skeleton, and invertebrates, animals that don't. And sea stars, they fit in the don't side, so they are an invertebrate. And they belong to a very unique group of animals, or a phyla of animals, called echinoderms. Echinoderm means spiny skin. And if you think about a sea star, or if you've ever had the opportunity to touch a sea star, you'll know that that is fairly accurate. Although some sea stars aren't spiny at all and don't feel rough, some feel very smooth. But so do some of their cousins or other animals in the echinoderm phyla. The echinoderms include things like sea urchins, which we've talked about those a little bit with the sea otter critter chat. Very spiny creatures that live in the sea. They look kind of like a pincushion or a cush ball. Sand dollars, if you're familiar with those are also echinoderms. And sea cucumbers are echinoderms. But today we're going to focus on sea stars. So we know they don't have a backbone, but they do have some other very unique features. So they kind of look really simple. They seem to live a simple life. They seem pretty basic, but they are actually very complex with a lot of different unique functions going on that are kind of hard for our human brains to understand because they are so different than how we live life and how many of the other animals we're more familiar with live life. Many of us, when we were children, may have seen sea stars at the beach or at tide pools or at zoos, aquariums, and marine parks. I remember when I was little and I went to SeaWorld, that was the first time I got to touch a sea star, and I was very excited about that. And it's a memory that really helped propel my interest and love towards the animal kingdom. So for starters, with sea stars, they don't have a lot of the same things that we have. For example, one of the things that we have that helps supply our body with nutrition is blood. Sea stars don't have blood. They do have a vascular system, or kind of like our circulatory system, but they also don't have a heart. But their vascular system is a series of canals that doesn't use blood to transport nutrients to its body. It uses seawater. It's surrounded by seawater, so why not just absorb some of that and use seawater to transport materials and nutrition throughout its body. So the seawater enters through a very special spot on a sea star. It's on the, as we look at sea stars, it's on the top of the sea star, and it's a little roundish dot, usually about this big. Most sea stars are about the size of my hand, right? They're about that big. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but most are about this size. So on the top side, there's this little round dot, and it's called a madreporite, which is kind of cool that like scientists have given this very special dot on a sea star its own scientific name, a madreporite. But a madreporite is a very special valve that allows seawater to enter into the sea star's body, and it controls the pressure inside its body to help move that seawater around, to move the different nutrients throughout its body. But the madreporite controls this pressure for another big important reason too. The seawater also helps to power how a sea star moves. So we briefly mentioned that they don't have fins, so they don't swim. They're not a fish swimming around out there. They don't move their arms like this to move. They actually walk. They have little feet. On the bottom side of a sea star, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of little dangly bits that are on its 5 different arms. Those are called tube feet. And the tube feet are very important. So they're each kind of a little wiggly guy that fills up with the seawater from their vascular system. And as it does that, it kind of extends out, and it's kind of like a suction cup on the end, and it sticks to the rock or the kelp or the sand or the pier or the boat or whatever it is that it's sticking to under the ocean. And these little tube feet, they kind of go over each other like this and slowly attach to different areas. And that helps the entire sea star kind of walk or glide along its surface. Now, they're not going to be able to run like we can run, but they can move decent pace, especially for something that looks like it stays still all the time. At the aquarium, I've had a lot of opportunity to work closely with sea stars and to watch how they move. And they can cover a space of about 2 feet in about 10 minutes. If they really need to, they can maybe do that in 5 minutes if they're really trying to move for some reason, if they feel threatened or endangered. They could probably cover that space in about 5 minutes. So they don't move super fast, but they're also not as slow as we think. Now these tube feet, they help them move, right? They pull their self along the ocean floor. But the tube feet also do something very important. They hold on very tight to the rocks or the sand or the pier or whatever it is they're holding on to, and kind of anchor the sea star in place against the constant waves of the ocean, right? Or the tide or the current. All that water moving around could easily pick something as little as a sea star up and carry it off to another space. But those tube feet actually kind of, with their suction cup, they kind of help hold it onto the rock and hold it in place. Even if there's big waves crashing against it, they help hold that sea star in place. But that's not all the tube feet do. They do so much. So they also use their tube feet to catch their food. Yeah, most people think that a sea star is kind of slow moving, so it might be like a vegetarian, or maybe it eats some algae, and it will on occasion in some species eat algae. But for the most part, sea stars are voracious carnivores. They eat other animals, and it's pretty gnarly, and they are excellent hunters, and they're very quick to be able to do that. Now, most sea stars, their favorite food are mollusks, which are other animals that live in the ocean. Typically, those are things like clams, oysters, mussels, and snails. But they will go after other things too. Things like shrimp. Some sea stars specialize in eating coral. Some will go after small fish. And they do so with their tube feet. So those little dangly bits that are on the underside again, those little suction cups help attach to whatever food source they find. Now, most of those items that are animals that live in a shell, like a clam or an oyster, they don't have the ability to move away, right? So the sea star kind of climbs over the top of them and it attaches its little tube feet to their shell, and then it pumps seawater through its vascular system into all those tube feet and makes them really strong and tight. And then it slowly pulls back like this, and that helps crack open that shell that the clam or the oyster or the mussel is living in. And as it cracks open that shell, it usually takes about 10 minutes to get it open. And then it centers kind of its mouth area over the top of wherever the hole is in the shell. And then it does something very, very odd and very unique. Most sea stars eat by actually ejecting part of their stomach out of their body and into wherever they're eating. So it's kind of vomits up its stomach into the shell of the clam, and then it starts to digest the clam inside the clam shell. And then when it's kind of done loosening up all that clam meat, it kind of starts to retract and pull that back up into the sea star animal. Now, this process sometimes takes a long time. Can take hours for it to eat one clam, but they also sometimes only eat once or twice in a week. So especially if they live in cold water, all their functions kind of go a little bit slower, and they don't need to eat every day like we do. Again, they're also cold-blooded. Well, they're not even blooded. They're a ectotherm, so they don't rely too much on maintaining the same body temperature, and they can often live in very cold water situations. So back to those little wiggly tube feet, right? So they help it move, they help it hold in place on the rocks, they help it to eat, but we're still not done talking about the tube feet and the amazing things that they do. The tube feet also help them get their oxygen. So we talked about how they're not fish, they don't have gills. They also don't have lungs like we do, so they don't come to the surface to breathe. They can extract the oxygen from the water around them. And they do that through those tube feet. So these little feet of theirs are pretty impressive, right? They help them move, they help them stay in place on the rocks, they help them eat their food, and they help them gain their oxygen. Those tube feet are super, super important to a sea star. And because of that, it's very important if you ever have the opportunity to touch a sea star, whether you're at the ocean or in an aquarium, a zoo, or a marine park, someplace that has sea stars, please don't touch the bottom side, okay? That's where their tube feet are, and they have little suction cups on them, so they can actually stick to your hand, and if they stick to your hand and you pull away real fast, you can hurt them. So please don't touch the bottom side of a sea star. You can touch the top side, that's fine, that's safe. But please don't touch the bottom side. We don't want to hurt them. Those tube feet are vital for their survival. Some sea stars have thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of tube feet. Some only have about 100 or so. So it kind of depends on the sea star how many tube feet they have and how big those tube feet are. Tube feet are super important to a sea star though. That's how they live. That's how they move. That's how they breathe. That's how they catch their food. Now, scientists have identified over 2,000 species of sea stars, and they continue to find new species of sea stars all the time. Every year, there's new sea stars being found. That's because the ocean is huge, and there's a lot of places in the ocean we haven't explored, and some sea stars are very specific to where they live. So we typically think of sea stars living along the edge of the ocean, kind of near the beach and like rocky areas and tide pools. Well, that's just because that's the area that's most accessible for us that they live. But some sea stars actually live in a lot of different places. There's sea stars that live on coral reefs. There's sea stars that live in the kelp beds where there's really tall, big seaweed, like a seaweed forest. There's sea stars that live super, super, super deep water. We're talking 20,000 feet deep water. That's like 4 miles deep. That's really, really deep, deep water. But they found sea stars that live on the ocean floor that deep. Sea stars live in really warm places, places near the equator, places like Hawaii or the Caribbean, where the water is very warm all the time. Sea stars live in places where the water is kind of medium temperature, like California, Oregon, Washington. Sea stars live in places that have really cold water, like Alaska, Canada, Antarctica. When I looked at a map today of where sea stars lived, it showed the whole world, and the places that the sea stars live was colored in yellow, and everything else where they didn't live was white. And all the land on the whole earth was white, and all the ocean on the whole world was yellow. They live everywhere in the ocean. There's not a marine habitat that they don't live in. So they are everywhere in the ocean, but they're nowhere outside of the ocean. So they don't really live in rivers or lakes very much, or streams or anything like that. There's a few little areas that are like a bay where the ocean meets a river. They'll be in that area. That's technically considered brackish water. So there's salt water, there's fresh water. Brackish water is that in-between water where seawater and fresh water meet. So they do live in those areas, but pretty much it's the ocean and those areas that sea stars live in. So most species of sea stars, scientists have identified over 2,000 kinds. They're the size of my hand, right? They also usually have 5 arms, like 5 fingers on my hand, although they're more symmetrical position. That's called radial symmetry, when they kind of all go out at the same angle and form 5 arms. Now most have 5 arms, but there are some species that have more. There's some that have 10. There's some that have 20. There's even one kind that has about 40 arms. There are some sea stars that are smaller than my hand, and there's a couple that are bigger. There's one that lives here off the coast of California that's much bigger. It's called a sunflower sea star, and it can live anywhere from about Monterey Bay in middle of California all the way up through Alaska. But from one side of its many arms, they usually have about 20 to 24 arms. From one side of its body to the other side of its of the body, they are about 3 feet across, or they can be that big. They are also one of the heaviest sea stars, weighing in over 13 pounds, which that may not sound very much, but this is an animal with no bones. So that's quite a big animal, considering it doesn't have a skeleton to help keep it organized and keep it functioning with the support system that it needs. So 13 pounds is a huge sea star. So one other crazy thing with sea stars, and you've probably heard of this, if not, this will be a fun surprise feature today. They can regrow their arms. So if there's a sea star out there and it has 5 arms, like my 5 fingers, and say it gets crunched between like a boat and a dock, and it crushes this arm and that arm breaks off and falls off. So now it has 4. It can regrow that one. It takes some time, but it can regrow that. And some of the sea stars that I work with at the aquarium are in the process of regrowing arms. And some of them I see almost every day that I'm there. So I'm excited when I do get to go back to work to be able to see how much more they've grown. There's one in particular that we all call Patrick because he's pink and he's big, like Patrick from SpongeBob. He's called a giant pink sea star. But he has 4 really long arms and 1 really short arm because he's in the process of growing his arm back. So it will be really fun to go back to the aquarium to see how big his arm got in this time frame we haven't been at work. Now there's also another thing that some species of sea stars can do, and that's that they can totally split in half and become 2 sea stars. That also takes a long time. That takes years. But there's a sea star at the aquarium that we think is in the process of doing it. So we talked at the very beginning about this very special valve that controls the pressure inside the sea star and lets seawater in to help move the nutrients around. That's called a madreporite. There's a sea star at the aquarium that has 2 madreporites. It's also a species of sea star that typically has 5 arms, but this one has 7. So it has 7 arms and 2 madreporites, and we believe that this sea star is in the process of becoming 2 sea stars. So I'm also very excited to go back and see what happened to this sea star during this time we've been away. But I will be waiting for several weeks at least before that happens. So we will see what happens when I return to the aquarium. But the regeneration of limbs is something amazing, right? That's not something we can do. If you get your finger cut off, sorry, your finger's gone. You can get a fake finger. Sometimes they can reattach it if it's just a tiny little bit that got cut off. But yeah, that's usually not something that people can have happen. For sea stars, they can do that really easily. Most of them are capable of regenerating a limb pretty easily. So that's pretty incredible for an animal that doesn't have a skeleton, and for an animal that we kind of think of as being pretty simple and pretty basic. So let's talk a little bit about sea star threats. So there's one big threat that faces all sea stars across the world. Actually, there's two, but the one that we'll talk about first is pollution. With the ocean is kind of the last stop for a lot of things. Everything on land can eventually end up in the ocean. So that includes all of our trash, anything that's sitting around on the sidewalk or the driveway or the streets. When it rains, especially if you're in a coastal area like I am here in California, when it rains, all of that gets pushed to a drain, and then that drain goes into a canal, and the canal goes into a river, and the river goes into the ocean. And then all that trash that got pushed by the rainwater is now in the ocean with all the fish, all the sea stars, everything else that's trying to live out there. So pollution is a big problem for all marine animals. And it's not necessarily like a piece of garbage that's the biggest problem for sea star. It's more the chemicals. So it's things like oil spills or pesticides or fertilizers, toxic chemicals that cause a lot of harm to different plants or sometimes different animals can definitely have an impact on any marine animals, and it can cause huge problems in the local marine life near places where rivers empty into the sea. So again, that's that coastal habitat we talked about where a lot of sea stars tend to live. There is another big problem with sea stars, and they first noticed around 2013 that there was a special disease that was attacking sea stars off the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington. Also in Mexico. It ended up spreading from Mexico all the way up to Alaska, and they called it the sea star wasting disease. In 2013, they first documented it. And what it is that the sea star's body starts to shrivel up a little bit, and then its limbs slowly start to like fall off, and its body gets really sick looking, really skinny, and it's unable to regenerate its body and its arms, and they slowly just start to decompose, and then they die. So it was first spotted in the Pacific Ocean, near California and Oregon border, and then they noticed it on the other side of America as well, starting in New Jersey and going up through the edge of the United States to Canada, up through Maine. So they called this sea star wasting disease. And during the years of 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, it had huge impacts on the sea star populations in a lot of those areas. That caused a lot of imbalance in the marine ecosystems because sea stars eat a lot of things like clams and oysters and sea urchins. And when there's not predators out there eating those things overtake things really quickly. So sometimes there's too many of those animals if the sea stars start to disappear. So I mentioned earlier the big sea star, the sunflower sea star that lives off the coast of California. That's one of the species that got affected by this sea star wasting disease really dramatically, to the point that in certain locations they can no longer find that species alive. They lost about 96% of them throughout most of California. So, and up through Oregon and Washington. They're still doing better up in Alaska and Canada, but they kind of had disappeared from the southern end of their range. So for years, this disease was causing lots of problems, lots of deaths of different types of sea stars. It also affected a ton of the starfish or sea stars in the tide pools of Oregon and Washington, and it caused a lot of alarm with some of the aquariums as well. There's an aquarium in Tacoma, Washington, that it actually caused problems with their sea stars that lived at the aquarium. And after a year and a half of fighting the disease, they only had 100 of their 3,000 sea stars left. So it got into the aquarium system as well and caused a big problem there. And the thing that they think caused this or helped it to spread was ocean warming. That's something we've talked about a little bit before in some of the other critter chats, but warm oceans are a big problem globally. So the ocean is everywhere in the world, and the world itself is getting warmer each year. We set new records for heat. That affects both land temperatures and water temperatures. In some places, the water temperatures are rising faster than the land temperatures. And when the water gets warmer, it throws off a lot of different things. Animals need certain temperature restraints of where they live. And sometimes when there's warmer water, it's harder for them to reproduce. It's harder for them to find food. It's harder for them to live their normal life. It also sometimes means animals from warmer places start living in the places that used to be kind of cooler temperatures, and now they have all these new neighbors moving in trying to outcompete with them for food, and that is also a problem. So ways that we can help out the ocean is lowering our carbon footprint. That sounds kind of technical, but what that means is use less energy. Use less energy in all of its forms. So if that's electricity in your house, turn off your lights. If you're not using an appliance for a long time, unplug it. If you're right here where I live, it gets really warm during the days right now. Yesterday was in the 90s, but then it cools off at night. So in the evening, when the outside temperature gets cooler than our house temperature inside, we open our windows, and that lets the cool air come inside our house, and we can turn off the air conditioner. So that also saves energy, and that saves you money. Who doesn't like to save money too, right? So by using less energy, that can help lower our carbon footprint and can help lower the temperatures globally for the air, for the land, and for the water. And that can help out animals and people, honestly, across the planet. So today's special shout out is for my employer, Aquarium of the Pacific. They've really helped me learn a lot about ocean animals, and they do a lot of conservation work to help out some of those animals as well. My experience in working with the sea stars there has been really eye-opening to me, because I just kind of always thought that they're cute, they're cool, it's an animal that's shaped like a star, that's great, but I had no idea they were capable of so many unique and kind of crazy fun facts that I've shared with you today. So I'll post some more information about sea stars later on. Hopefully I can find a good video that shows them eating, because it is pretty fascinating to watch as they eat a clam. We'll find that and post that later today on the Facebook profile. Also, feel free to like, share, follow, and subscribe to any of the Zoo Nerd content across the platforms, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, where full videos are uploaded daily. So that's kind of it for the Critter Chat today. Today is also Save the Rhino Day. I invite you to go back and watch the Critter Chat on rhinos. I believe that was episode 2. So that was quite a while ago, but it should be there on Facebook. It's definitely up on YouTube. Go back and watch that if you're interested in rhinos. There's some great information in that. I will also be sharing some other information from some of our other special shout outs. I've seen a lot of really cute images and photos, so I'll be sharing some of those that don't necessarily correlate with sea stars, but are some fun images and videos to watch. So I'll be sharing some of that later on today as well. As always, take care of yourself, be happy, be healthy, stay safe, stay home. Bye, see you tomorrow.